He tore it in half before she could say a word. Not slowly, not with hesitation. Seo Tae-jun's hands moved the way they always moved when he had already decided something, fast, final, and without apology. The ultrasound photograph split down the middle with a sound so small it shouldn't have mattered. But in that silent penthouse, with rain hammering the Seattle skyline outside, that paper tearing was the loudest thing Imani Rowe had ever heard. She stood completely still. Her hands, which had been reaching toward him just a second before, dropped to her sides. The pieces fell to the black marble floor like something that had never mattered. "This child is not mine," Tae-jun said. His voice was flat, certain. The same voice he used to end conversations with men who owed him money. "Get out." If you've ever loved someone who made you feel like the worst decision you ever made, stay with me. Because this story is about to go somewhere. Most love stories are too afraid to go. Before we continue, if you're new here, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that penthouse, back to that floor covered in torn paper, back to the night Imani Rowe stopped being the woman who waited. The ultrasound had been in Imani's jacket pocket for 11 days. She had folded it carefully the first time, then unfolded it, folded it again, carried it to work, carried it to the grocery store, sat with it on the floor of her bathroom at 2 in the morning when she couldn't sleep, studying that small gray shadow on white paper like it was a map to somewhere she'd never been, something she hadn't planned for and couldn't stop thinking about. She was 29 years old. She had a graduate degree in environmental policy that she barely used because the job market had other ideas. She had a studio apartment with a leaking kitchen faucet she'd fixed herself 3 times. She had a mother in Atlanta who didn't know about Tae-jun, and she had Tae-jun, which meant she also had secrets and silence, and a life that existed in 2 completely separate boxes that she had never figured out how to open at the same time. She was also, as of 11 days ago, 8 weeks pregnant. The night she drove to Tae-jun's building, she had told herself she wasn't afraid. She had rehearsed what she would say during the 40-minute drive. She practiced in the elevator. By the time his private floor opened and she stepped into the controlled cool of his penthouse, she had an entire speech prepared, careful and measured and full of practical suggestions, because she knew the way Tae-jun's mind worked. He responded to structure, to logic, to things that made sense on paper. But she hadn't planned for the way her hands started shaking the moment she saw his face. Tae-jun was standing near the window when she arrived, his back to the city lights, still in his suit jacket despite the late hour. That was Tae-jun. He didn't loosen his collar until the room was completely empty of everyone except her. He didn't relax his shoulders until he was certain no one was watching. Even then, it happened slowly, like something his body did against his will. He had looked at her when she came in. That was the first thing. He always actually looked at her, not through her, not past her. Tae-jun's attention was total when he gave it, and for a long time that had felt like the most valuable thing Imani had ever been given. The full, unwavering attention of a man who had learned to watch everything. "You're late," he said. It wasn't angry, it was just an observation. Traffic on I-5 was terrible. It's always terrible on I-5. "And yet," Imani said, "here I am." She had meant it to be light, one of those small back and forths that had always come easily between them. But her voice came out slightly wrong, and Tae-jun noticed immediately, because he noticed everything. His eyes sharpened. He crossed the room without hurrying. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," Imani said, which was either the most accurate or the least accurate thing she had ever said to him. She reached into her jacket pocket. She had thought about this moment 100 different ways. She had imagined him going quiet. She had imagined him asking careful, logical questions. She had imagined him sitting down heavily. She had even, in her most private and embarrassed moments, imagined him pulling her toward him with something that looked close to relief. Because Imani had known, for a long time, that Tae-jun was a man carrying an enormous amount of loneliness inside a life that didn't allow him to admit it. She had not imagined his face going completely blank. She had not imagined the way his hands, those careful, controlled hands, took the photograph and held it for exactly 4 seconds before something shifted behind his eyes. Not softness, not even shock. Something colder than either. She had not imagined what came next. The paper tore before she understood what was happening. When the pieces hit the floor, Imani's rehearsed speech disappeared entirely. Everything she had planned to say simply left her, the way air leaves a room when a window shatters. She stood there and stared at the torn photograph against the black marble, and for a long moment her brain refused to process it. Tae-jun, you need to go. He turned away from her, back to the window. His shoulders were rigid. Would you look at me? He didn't move. Tae-jun, I need you to look at me right now. He turned slowly. And what she saw on his face was worse than anger. Anger she could have argued with. What she saw instead was the expression of a man who had already decided. Closed. Final. The same look she had seen him give other people in other rooms. And she had always known, somewhere in her chest, that the terrifying thing about Tae-jun was not his temper. It was his certainty. That child is not mine, he said again. I was told years ago, after treatment. My body cannot... He stopped. His jaw tightened. It is not possible. I haven't been with anyone else. I'm not arguing with you. Then what are you doing? Imani's voice broke on the last word, which she hated because she had told herself she wouldn't let that happen. What are you doing right now? Because you just tore apart a photograph of our baby, and you won't even... Our baby. He said it the way someone repeats a word in a foreign language they don't believe is real. Not cruel, exactly, but hollow. I told you about my condition a long time ago. You knew. I was transparent with you about this. Your condition. Your condition from years ago, from a diagnosis some doctor gave you when you were in the middle of treatment and your body was... Nothing has changed. How do you know that? The silence between them was different from the silences they had shared before. Those silences had always been comfortable, full of something unspoken that didn't need to be said. This silence was something else. It had weight. It pressed against her chest. I know, Tae-jun said quietly, because I know. Imani looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the man who had held her through 2 different nights when she couldn't breathe. Once after a call from a hospital in Atlanta about her mother. Once after a case she'd been working on had collapsed and she'd sat in her car for an hour before she could walk into her apartment. She looked at the man who had brought her soup without being asked, who had argued with her about movies for 45 minutes and then watched her choice anyway and admitted grudgingly that it was good. She looked at the man who had just told her with absolute certainty that her child was not his. Then she bent down. She picked up both pieces of the torn ultrasound from the floor. She held them together briefly with the image aligned, the small gray shadow, the measurement markers along the side, the printed date in the corner. Then she placed both pieces carefully in the pocket of her jacket. She did not slam his door when she left. She did not cry in the elevator. She made it to her car, pulled out of the parking garage, drove exactly 1.4 miles down the road, and then pulled into a gas station lot and sat with her forehead against the steering wheel for 6 minutes. She counted. It helped her breathing. Then she started the engine again. For the next 48 hours, Imani moved through her apartment like she was waiting for something. She wasn't sure what. Some part of her kept expecting her phone to light up with Tae-jun's name, not because she thought he would apologize, but because in 2 years she had never seen him walk away from an unresolved situation. He was not a man who tolerated loose ends. He wrapped things up. He controlled outcomes. He appeared. Her phone stayed quiet. On the second night, she sat at her kitchen table and made a list. Not an emotional list, a practical one. She was 8 weeks pregnant. She was in a relationship, or had been, as of 48 hours ago, with a man whose name appeared in federal surveillance documents as a person of interest. She had no illusions about what Tae-jun's world was capable of. She had spent 2 years watching from close enough to understand that the line between protected and trapped, in his world, was thinner than it looked. She thought about what would happen if she stayed in Seattle. She thought about what it would mean to raise a child in proximity to Tae-jun's organization, regardless of whether he acknowledged paternity. She thought about her daughter in Atlanta, who didn't know any of this was happening. Then she stopped thinking and started packing. She told no one she was leaving. She didn't call her landlord. She just left a note with 2 months' rent in cash, money she'd been saving for a different reason entirely. She forwarded nothing. She turned off location sharing on her phone, then bought a new phone with cash at a pharmacy outside the city. She drove south on I-5 with a single suitcase and a paper bag of groceries and both halves of a torn ultrasound in her jacket pocket. Portland received her without ceremony. She found an apartment above a laundromat off a side street in a quiet neighborhood. 340 square feet with a radiator that clanked all night, and a window that looked out over a fire escape. She paid first and last month's rent in cash, gave a name that wasn't quite hers, and signed nothing she didn't have to. That was how Imani Rowe disappeared. Not dramatically, not completely, just enough. She found night shift work cleaning corporate office buildings. The kind of work that paid cash, asked minimal questions, and left her days free for clinic appointments. She was on her feet for 7 hours at a stretch, pushing a cart through empty hallways, and some nights her lower back hurt so badly she had to stop and lean against a wall for a few minutes before she could keep going. And she did, because she had always been better at enduring things than she was at asking for help. That was not always a virtue, but it was hers. The pregnancy progressed week by week with the stubborn reliability of biology. By her 14th week, the morning sickness that had been making everything impossible finally started to ease. She gained 1.5 pounds. She read about fetal development on her phone at night, the screen turned low, lying on her side in the dark. She read that at this point the baby could make faces. She stared at the ceiling and thought about that for a long time. She was going to do this alone. She had accepted that. What she hadn't quite figured out was what to do with the grief of it. Because there was grief, tangled up in everything else. Grief for the version of this pregnancy she had been secretly carrying in her head for 11 days before she'd driven to that penthouse. She had not admitted to herself, until she was sitting in a Portland clinic waiting room with a number tag in her hand, how much she had wanted that other version. The one where his face had done something different when she handed him the photograph. She pressed her lips together and opened a magazine she wasn't reading and waited for her name to be called. She did not contact Tae-jun. She did not look at the news coverage when his organization made the papers again in late November. She didn't let herself. She had learned early in their relationship that paying attention to his world was how you got pulled into it, and she had a different gravity to orbit now. Her daughter kicked for the first time on a Tuesday afternoon in December, when Imani was eating a bowl of rice and watching rain streak the window. It felt like a small insistence, like someone tapping from inside a wall to let you know they were there. Imani set down her bowl very carefully. She placed her hand against her stomach. "I know," she said, to the empty apartment, to the rain, to the small, insistent life that didn't care about any of the complicated things surrounding it. "I know you're there." She had never cried about any of this. She had been too focused, too practical, too busy surviving to stop long enough to feel the full weight of what had happened in that penthouse. She didn't cry now, but she sat with her hand pressed flat against her stomach for a long time, and outside the rain kept falling, and the radiator clanked and ticked, and somewhere across the city Tae-jun was running an empire. And here, above a laundromat in Portland, a woman who had loved him and been disbelieved was learning to build something entirely without him. She promised herself one thing that evening, not out loud, not the way promises are made in stories, with good lighting and the right words. She made it quietly, the way she did most things. Her daughter would never grow up believing fear was the same thing as love. She had seen what that cost a person. She was not going to pass it on. The radiator stopped clanking sometime in early January. Imani didn't notice at first. She had gotten so used to the sound that its absence felt wrong in a way she couldn't immediately identify, like a word missing from a sentence she'd memorized. She lay in the dark for 3 mornings in a row before she figured out what was different. Then she reached out, pressed her palm against the metal ribbing, and felt nothing. Cold all the way through. She called the building manager. He said he'd look into it. That was a Thursday. By Saturday, she had borrowed a space heater from the woman downstairs, a retired school teacher named Dolores, who asked no questions and offered tea every single time Imani knocked. Imani accepted the heater and declined the tea and went back upstairs and sat with her coat on and her hands wrapped around a mug of instant coffee, watching her own breath in the air of her apartment. She was 19 weeks pregnant. The cold didn't bother her the way it would have a year ago. She was running warmer now, her body doing something she didn't fully understand, generating heat from the inside out. But she pressed her coat tighter anyway because some habits are about more than temperature. She had a clinic appointment in 2 days. She had a shift that night starting at 10. She had exactly $112 in her checking account and $400 in cash taped inside the spine of a book on her nightstand. a habit she'd started 3 weeks after arriving in Portland, the same week she'd realized she needed to be the kind of person who always had an exit available. She was getting good at this. The organizing, the containing, the reducing of her life to its absolutely necessary components. What she was less good at was the 3 o'clock hour. Every night, without exception, she woke between 2:50 and 3:10. Not from bad dreams, not from discomfort, though there was plenty of that. She woke because her body had apparently decided that this was the hour when all the things she successfully managed during daylight hours were allowed to surface. She would lie on her side with her hand flat against her stomach and stare at the middle distance and think about things she had specifically told herself not to think about. She thought about Tae-jun's hands, not the way they'd moved when they tore the photograph. Earlier than that, the way he used to rest one hand between her shoulder blades when they were standing in a crowd. Not possessive, not even particularly visible, just present. Just a hand saying, "I know where you are. I'm here." She pressed her palm harder against her stomach and made herself breathe slowly until the 3 o'clock hour passed. She never let herself think about him for more than a few minutes at a time. She had a system. She allowed the thought in, she looked at it directly, and then she put it somewhere manageable and moved on. It was the same system she used for everything that hurt. It wasn't healthy, probably, but it worked, and right now working was what mattered. What she did not know, lying in the dark in her 340 square foot apartment above a laundromat in Portland, was that 900 miles north, her system was already starting to fail. Seo Tae-jun had not slept past 4 in the morning since November. His lieutenant, Park Dong-hyun, had been with him for 11 years. He had watched Tae-jun absorb things that would have hospitalized other men. He had watched him negotiate contracts while bleeding from a cut above his eye. He had watched him bury people he cared about with his face completely arranged, not because he didn't feel it, but because he had decided somewhere along the way that the organization needed him not to feel it in public. Dong-hyun had learned to read Tae-jun the way you learn to read weather, not from what was visible, but from the slight changes in pressure before anything actually happened. He had been reading a storm for 6 weeks. It started small. Tae-jun began arriving to morning briefings early, which he never did. He was always precisely on time, not a minute before. He stopped eating full meals, which his kitchen staff noticed immediately and reported to Dong-hyun because that was the kind of organization it was. He started asking questions about specific contracts they had resolved months ago, pulling old files, looking for details nobody else would have found meaningful. And he had stopped talking about the woman. That was the thing. Because for nearly 2 years, Tae-jun had never explicitly talked about her either. Not to Dong-hyun, not to anyone. He was private in the way that men who have spent their lives watching their words become weapons tend to be private. But there had always been a presence to her existence in his life. Certain evenings became unavailable without explanation. Certain requests got delayed until the following morning. The kitchen occasionally received instructions to prepare things that weren't on anyone's regular menu. A particular spice blend, a specific temperature for something. Those gaps in the schedule had disappeared. The kitchen instructions had stopped. Dong-hyun noticed. He filed the information carefully and said absolutely nothing. What he didn't know was what had actually happened. Tae-jun had told no one. There was no version of that conversation that Tae-jun was willing to have with any member of his organization, which meant that Dong-hyun was working entirely from symptoms with no diagnosis. The symptoms were getting worse. 3 weeks into December, Tae-jun called a meeting about the organization's medical contractor, a physician who handled discrete health matters for members of the organization who couldn't visit regular practices. The meeting was framed as a routine review. Tae-jun asked detailed questions about the contractor's record-keeping practices, the security of archived patient files, the accessibility of historical documentation. Nobody thought anything of it. That was the kind of meeting Tae-jun ran. Thorough, precise, looking for exposure before it became a problem. What nobody knew was that 20 minutes after that meeting ended, Tae-jun was on the phone with a specialist at a private clinic in Vancouver. His voice was steady when he made the appointment. He gave a name that wasn't quite his and paid the deposit in a method that couldn't be traced back to the organization. He wrote the date on a physical piece of paper rather than any device, folded it once, and put it in the inside pocket of his coat. He did not examine why he was doing this. He examined almost everything. It was constitutionally incapable of leaving a problem unexamined. He had built an organization that functioned as well as it did precisely because he never assumed. He verified, he tested, he challenged, and he adjusted. He had not verified this. He had taken a diagnosis from 8 years ago, given at the peak of a medical crisis, by a physician who was working with the information available at the time, and he had treated it as permanent fact. He had treated it as a wall. And walls, Tae-jun knew better than most people, had a way of being less solid than they appeared from a distance. He sat with that thought in the back of his car on the drive home from the meeting, the Seattle skyline gray outside the window, rain coming in sideways off the water. He had told her he knew. She had asked him how he knew. He had said, "I know because I know." That was not an answer. That was a man closing a door because he was afraid of what was on the other side. Tae-jun was not accustomed to being afraid. He was not accustomed to it, and he was not equipped to handle it gracefully, and what he understood now, sitting in the back of a car moving through Seattle rain, was that when the fear had arrived, when she had stood in front of him holding that photograph and looking at him with something that was half hope and half terror, he had done what frightened men do. He had made it her problem instead of his. He pressed his fingers against the bridge of his nose. Hard. The kind of pressure that doesn't help but gives the hand something to do. Dong-hyun, in the front seat, said nothing. Tae-jun's sister, Seo Nari, arrived in Seattle on a Thursday in January without calling ahead. This was not unusual for Nari. She was 32 years old, worked in biomedical research at a university in San Francisco, and operated on the persistent assumption that whatever she was doing was more important than whatever anyone else had planned. She also operated on the persistent assumption that her brother needed looking after, which he did not, except for the times when he did, and simply refused to admit it. She found him in his home office at 7 in the evening. He was at his desk, but he wasn't working. He was sitting in front of an open file with his hands flat on the desk on either side of it, not moving, staring at nothing with the expression of a man who had been in the same position for an indeterminate amount of time. Nari stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she walked in, pulled up a chair, and sat down across from him. "You look terrible," she said. "You're here unannounced, again. Because when I announce myself, you tell me you're busy." She looked at the file on the desk, then she looked at him. "What is that?" "Work. Oppa." She used the Korean word without thinking about it, the older brother honorific she'd been using since she was old enough to talk. "What's actually going on?" Tae-jun was quiet for a long time, long enough that Nari almost let it go. She was better at reading his silences than most people, which meant she knew that this particular silence was not the kind that preceded deflection. It was the kind that preceded something he had been carrying for too long. "I may have made a mistake," he said finally. Nari waited, he told her. Not everything, not the parts that were raw enough that he still hadn't looked at them directly himself, but the pregnancy. The diagnosis he had held on to, the way he had reacted. Nari's face went through several things while he spoke. She had the same controlled features he did, the same baseline expression that gave away very little, but she was not as practiced as he was, and he could see exactly what was happening as she processed what he was telling her. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The diagnosis was from Dr. Yoon," she said. "Yes." "After the treatment in 2016? "Yes." Nari sat back. She crossed her arms and looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was what she did when she was arranging information. "Tae-jun, the treatment you had in 2016 was aggressive, and the data they were working from at that time about long-term fertility impact was—" She stopped herself, started over, in the way she did when she remembered she was talking to someone who wasn't a researcher. The understanding of how that particular treatment affects long-term reproductive function has changed significantly in the last 4 years. There have been cases, documented cases, of partial or significant recovery, especially in patients who were under 40 at the time of treatment. The room was very quiet. "What are you saying?" Tae-jun said. It was not quite a question. His voice had that flatness it got when he was receiving information that was reorganizing everything. "I'm saying the diagnosis you were given in 2016 was accurate for 2016. It was not necessarily a permanent verdict. It was a snapshot." Nari leaned forward. "I'm saying you may need to have new testing done." And I'm saying that depending on what those results show, everything you think you know about this situation might be wrong. Tae-jun looked at the file on his desk. She left Seattle, he said. I know. He looked at his sister. You knew? I heard. I didn't say anything because… Nari pressed her lips together. Because I thought you knew what you were doing. Because I gave you credit for having thought it through. Her voice stayed even. That was the most cutting thing about Nari. She didn't need to raise her voice to make something land. I see now that I was wrong to do that. Nari. I'm not going to yell at you. I'm not going to tell you what a terrible thing that was to do, because I think some part of you already knows, and that's why you look like you haven't slept since November. She stood up. Get the testing done, Tae-jun. Whatever the results are, get the testing done. Because right now you're making decisions based on something that might not even be true, and in the meantime, there is a woman somewhere who is pregnant and alone because you… She stopped. She picked up her bag. Get the testing done, she said again, and left. Tae-jun sat alone in his office for a long time after she left. Then he reached into his coat pocket and took out a folded piece of paper. A date. A clinic in Vancouver. He had written it 2 weeks ago. He stared at it. Then he picked up the phone. What? The Vancouver appointment was on a Tuesday. Tae-jun drove himself, which he almost never did. He told Dong-hyun he had personal business and gave him enough of a look that Dong-hyun understood the category of question he was not to ask. He sat in the clinic for 40 minutes in a waiting room that smelled like clean carpet and artificial air, watching other patients come and go, keeping his face arranged. A woman across from him was reading a magazine. A man near the window had fallen asleep. The receptionist didn't look up from her desk. Nobody knew who he was in this room. That was both strange and, in a way he couldn't quite articulate, something close to relief. The specialist was direct and thorough, and treated him with the efficient courtesy of someone who had learned to provide medical information without attaching judgment to it. She took his history. She reviewed the 2016 documentation he had brought with him. She asked precise questions and wrote things down and did not make him feel like a case study, which he appreciated more than he expected. She ordered tests. He came back 2 days later. He sat in her office on the Thursday and listened to her explain the results. His fertility had not recovered fully. The treatment had done lasting damage. The numbers were not what they would be for a man who had never undergone that kind of intervention, but they were not zero. Your current parameters, the specialist said, organizing her language carefully, indicate a significantly reduced but non-zero probability of conception. The degree of reduction means that an unplanned pregnancy would be unlikely, but unlikely is not impossible. And given the timeline you've described and the documented recovery trajectory in cases comparable to yours, she paused. I cannot rule it out. I would not tell you it's impossible. I would not in good conscience tell you that. The drive back to Seattle took 2 hours and 40 minutes. Tae-jun did not turn on music. He did not make calls. He drove south on the highway with both hands on the wheel and the rain coming down. And he thought about a woman standing in his penthouse with her hands shaking and a photograph in her outstretched hand. He thought about the exact sound of paper tearing. He thought about 8 words. This child cannot be mine. Get out. He had said those words with absolute certainty. He had built them on a diagnosis from 8 years ago, from a medical crisis he had survived by refusing to look at it directly, by treating the outcome as a fixed fact he could file away and never re-examine. He had taken the most painful thing that had ever happened to him and sealed it behind a wall and called that wall certainty, because certainty was something he could work with. Certainty was something he could control. And when Imani had stood in front of him carrying something that threatened to break that wall open, he had done the only thing his instincts knew how to do. He had destroyed it first. He pulled into a rest stop somewhere south of the border and sat in the car with the engine running and the rain hammering the roof. He was breathing harder than the situation visibly warranted. His hands were still on the wheel. He had spent 37 years being a man who did not flinch, who absorbed information and made decisions and moved forward, who did not let himself be pulled backward into feelings that didn't serve the moment. Right now, sitting in a rest stop parking lot in the rain, he felt every single one of those years like weight. He had been wrong, not probably wrong, not possibly wrong. Wrong in a way that had sent a woman who had never once in 2 years given him a reason to doubt her, disappearing from her life in the middle of the night because staying felt too dangerous. Wrong in a way that meant somewhere, right now, she was navigating a pregnancy alone. Possibly afraid. Certainly exhausted. Without him. Because of him. He pressed the back of his head against the headrest and stared at the ceiling of the car. He could find her. The thought arrived the way it always arrived. Functionally, practically, as a simple statement of capability. His organization had found people who didn't want to be found before. People with far more resources than a 29-year-old woman with a new phone number and a cash-paid apartment. He could have an address within 48 hours. He could have eyes on her location within 72. He could appear at her door with his security behind him and his money in front of him and the full apparatus of his world arranged around him like armor. He sat with that thought for exactly long enough to recognize what it was. Then he set it aside. Because here was the thing Tae-jun had never been willing to look at directly. He had always known, somewhere underneath the function and the control, that there was a version of him that was capable of becoming the most dangerous thing in a room. Not because of the organization. Not because of the weapons, or the money, or the men who answered to him. Because of the particular combination of certainty and fear that lived in him, that had no outlet except force when it was threatened. He had already been the most dangerous thing in the room once. He had torn apart a photograph of his own child. I was not going to find her. Not the way his instincts were telling him to. Not with security. Not with money. Not with any of the machinery that had defined his entire adult life. He pulled back onto the highway in the rain. He drove back to Seattle. That night, Tae-jun sat alone in his office and wrote two things. The first was an internal memo restructuring operational responsibility for 3 of the organization's primary activities. Not dissolving them, not yet, but moving the direct management away from himself and to the lieutenants who had been running them operationally for years anyway. It was the kind of document that, if anyone read it carefully, signaled a shift in direction. Nobody would read it carefully yet. But the structure would be in place. The second thing he wrote was not a memo. It was the beginning of a legal document, establishing a trust. He called his private attorney at 10:30 that night and spoke for 20 minutes in a voice that allowed no questions about why. The attorney, who had known Tae-jun for 9 years and understood the category of requests he was not to question, took notes and said he would have a draft by the end of the week. No conditions on the trust. No requirement that she contact him. No strings. No mechanism that would force any kind of reunion or acknowledgement. Just money, placed where it would be available if it was ever needed. For a child whose existence he had spent 6 weeks refusing to accept. Dong-hyun knocked on the office door at 11. Tae-jun looked up. "The Portland situation," Dong-hyun said carefully. "Do you want me to continue monitoring?" There was a pause that lasted 4 full seconds. "No," Tae-jun said. "Pull everyone back. No surveillance. No contact. No presence in that area connected to us in any way." Dong-hyun held his expression perfectly steady. "Understood." "If I find out anyone has deviated from that instruction," Tae-jun said, "for any reason, I will consider it a personal offense." Dong-hyun nodded once and left. Tae-jun turned back to the document on his desk. He had spent his entire career building a world where he could control outcomes, where he could apply sufficient pressure in the right places and guarantee a result. That was the only way he had ever known how to operate, from a position of total information and the willingness to act on it. What he was being asked to do now, what the situation required, what the only version of himself he could respect required, was the opposite of everything he knew. He had to let the outcome be uncertain. He had to stop applying pressure. He had to put resources in place and then step back and wait and accept that she would decide. On her timeline. On her terms. Without any of the mechanisms he would normally reach for. He had to trust something he couldn't control. He had never done that in his life. He pressed his hands flat on the desk and breathed. In Portland, at that exact moment, Imani Rowe was lying on her side in a dark apartment above a laundromat, her hand pressed against her stomach, 21 weeks into a pregnancy that was quietly, stubbornly proceeding with or without anyone's permission. She felt the kick at 11:47 p.m., strong, insistent, a small body asserting its own presence in the dark. She exhaled. Neither of them knew that a legal document was being drafted with their daughter's name left blank, waiting to be filled in. Neither of them knew that the next move had already been made. Not by force, not by power, but by the one thing Tae-jun had never once in his life allowed himself to offer without conditions. He had let go. And that single act, invisible, unwitnessed, performed in a quiet office in Seattle while rain hit the windows, was the thing that made everything that came after possible, and the thing that made it necessary, and the thing from which neither of them could any longer walk away. The legal documents arrived on a Wednesday. Imani was coming back from a clinic appointment when she found the envelope tucked under her apartment door, not in the mailbox downstairs, not slid through the slot, but placed deliberately flat against the floor of her doorway, which meant someone had come up the stairs and stood directly outside her door. She stood in the hallway for a moment before she touched it. Her coat was still on. Her keys were in her hand. She looked at the envelope, then at the stairwell at the end of the hall, then at the envelope again. No return address. Her name spelled correctly, which meant whoever sent it knew her, or had been told. She unlocked her door, went inside, set her bag down, kept her coat on. She sat at the kitchen table and held the envelope for approximately 30 seconds before she opened it. The document inside was 12 pages. Legal language, dense and precise, the kind of language that has been constructed specifically to be unambiguous. She read the first page twice before the meaning fully assembled itself. A trust, established in her name, with her daughter listed as primary beneficiary, listed as daughter, female, expected arrival date. Noted from what could only have been the clinic record she had filed in Portland under a name that was almost but not quite her own. The trust was unconditional, no contact requirement, no acknowledgement required, no legal claim asserted over the child, no demand for paternity confirmation. The funds were already deposited. The terms were already active. There was no signature line for her. She didn't have to agree to anything. She didn't have to respond at all. At the bottom of the final page, below the attorney's contact information, someone had added 4 words in handwriting she recognized immediately. Not a message, not an apology, not an explanation, just 4 words. She is taken care of. Imani sat at her kitchen table for a very long time. The space heater Dolores had lent her clicked and hummed in the corner. Outside, rain moved through the street below with a sound like static. Her coat was still on. Her hands were flat on either side of the document. She was 22 weeks pregnant. She had $160 in her checking account. Her lower back had been hurting for 3 weeks in a way that wasn't getting better. She had not slept more than 5 consecutive hours in 2 months. The trust would cover the medical costs she had been quietly calculating and recalculating. It would cover the time she couldn't work after the delivery. It would cover the things she hadn't let herself add to the list because adding them to the list made them real. She pushed the document to the other side of the table. She did not want to feel grateful. Gratitude was a door she did not have the capacity to open right now because she knew exactly what was on the other side of it. The full weight of everything that had happened in that penthouse, and the full weight of the months since, and the question of what it meant that he had found her because he had found her, which meant every piece of careful disappearing she had done had been visible the entire time to anyone with the right resources and the willingness to use them. She had not been as invisible as she thought. That was not comforting. That was its own kind of information. She left the document on the table. She made herself eat something. She went to her shift at 10 and pushed her cart through empty corporate hallways for 7 hours and did not think about it. She came home at 6 in the morning, stood in her doorway looking at the envelope on the table, and thought, he knows where I am. He has known for some time. And he hasn't come. She didn't know what to do with that. She slept for 4 hours and woke up at noon and read the document again, more carefully this time. She read every clause. She looked for the mechanism, the part where accepting the trust obligated her to something, where the money came with a condition written in smaller text. She was thorough. She went through it 3 times. There was no mechanism. There was no condition. It was the most straightforward document she had ever read, which was somehow the most unsettling thing about it. She called the attorney's number. A receptionist answered. Imani asked 3 specific questions about the terms. The receptionist checked with someone and called her back in 20 minutes. The answers confirmed what she had read. No conditions. Fully active. No response required from her. She hung up and sat with the phone in her hands. She thought about the 4 words at the bottom of the last page. She thought about a man sitting somewhere in Seattle who had built his entire life around control and leverage and the strategic application of force, choosing to send money without strings, choosing to tell his people to back off, choosing to leave the door open without putting his foot in it. She didn't forgive him. She wasn't close to forgiving him. But something shifted in the architecture of the thing she was carrying, and she recognized it after a moment as the acknowledgement that he knew. That whatever had happened with the testing, and she could piece together that much, he knew the truth now. He knew what he had done. And he was doing the only thing that didn't require anything from her. She placed the document inside the book on her nightstand, next to the $400 in cash. She pressed her hand against her stomach. "I don't know what this means yet," she said, to the empty room, to the daughter who was currently trying to rearrange her internal organs. "But I'm working on it." She went back to work that night, and the night after that, and the one after that. She did not contact Tae-jun. In Seattle, the waiting was doing something to Tae-jun that he didn't have a framework for. He had restructured the operational side of the organization. Dong-hyun was running the day-to-day. The lieutenants who had been waiting for more responsibility for years were getting it, and most of them were handling it competently, which should have felt like validation, and instead felt like watching something you'd built get handed to other people. He still went to meetings, he still made decisions, but he had moved himself one step back from the machinery, and the machinery was running without him, and he sat in his office at night and had nothing to organize except his own thoughts, which was a position he had been actively avoiding for most of his adult life. He was not good at it. Nari called twice a week. He answered most of the time. She never asked directly about Imani. She asked about how he was sleeping, what he was eating, whether he'd been outside. The questions of someone who knew better than to aim at the center of the wound and instead worked around its edges, waiting for the inflammation to go down enough to approach directly. He appreciated it. He didn't say so. But he answered her calls, which was its own form of communication. Dong-hyun appeared in his doorway on a Thursday morning in late February with the particular quality of stillness that meant he was delivering information he was uncertain about. Tae-jun looked up from the desk. "There's something you should know," Dong-hyun said, "before you hear it another way." "Then tell me." Dong-hyun came in and closed the door. He stood rather than sitting, which was also information. One of the Portland contacts, not connected to any instruction I gave, acting independently, made contact with someone in her building. The temperature in the room did not change. Tae-jun's expression did not change. His hands, resting flat on the desk, stayed exactly where they were. "Define contact," Tae-jun said. "A conversation. A neighbor of hers." He identified himself as a property assessor, asked some questions about the building, the tenants. Nothing that would have signaled anything to her directly. Dong-hyun paused. The woman who spoke with him mentioned the pregnancy, the approximate stage, the fact that she was working nights. Tae-jun was quiet for 4 full seconds. "Who authorized this?" "No one, that's what I'm telling you. It was independent." "Who?" Dong-hyun said a name. Tae-jun looked at the desk. His jaw was doing the thing it did when he was working very hard at keeping his face managed. "Bring him in." "He's already, bring him in today." Dong-hyun nodded and left. The man's name was Kwon Seung-il. He was 34 years old, had been with the organization for 6 years, and operated with the particular brand of initiative that useful people sometimes had, the kind that made them valuable in situations that called for action and catastrophically dangerous in situations that called for restraint. He came into Tae-jun's office at 2 in the afternoon. He was not nervous, which was either confidence or a failure to understand the situation he was in. He stood straight. He met Tae-jun's eyes. "I was trying to keep you informed," Seung-il said, before Tae-jun had asked anything. "The instruction was no surveillance. I wasn't surveilling. I was maintaining awareness." "You spoke to someone in her building." "A neighbor. An old woman. She volunteered the information." "You presented yourself as a property assessor." Seung-il's jaw moved slightly. "I needed a reason to be there." "You needed a reason," Tae-jun repeated. His voice was completely even. "You needed a reason to be somewhere I explicitly told you to stay away from. With respect, you don't have my respect right now. Still even, still completely controlled. You have my attention. Those are different things." Tae-jun leaned back in his chair. "She is a private individual. She is not a liability. She is not a target. She is not a surveillance subject. When I give an instruction, I give it once. I gave this instruction once, and I attached a consequence to it, and you apparently made a calculation that the consequence was theoretical. Sungil's confidence was starting to recede, slowly, like a tide going out. The consequence is not theoretical, Tae-jun said. He dismissed Sungil from the organization that afternoon. Not violently. No drama. No message sent. He was simply gone, removed from every channel, his access revoked, his association ended cleanly and permanently. Tae-jun made sure the exit was contained. He didn't need the story to travel. But the damage was already a possibility, and Tae-jun knew it. If Seong-il had spoken to someone in her building, even obliquely, even without directly connecting anything to Tae-jun, there was a thread, a small one. But in Imani's position, with the level of wariness she had been operating under, a single unfamiliar thread was enough. She would notice. She might already have noticed. She might have a new plan already in motion. He sat with that for the rest of the day and could not do anything about it. This was the thing no one told you about letting go. It didn't stop things from happening. It just meant you couldn't control them when they did. Imani noticed the man on a Tuesday. She wouldn't have noticed if she hadn't been trained by 2 years of proximity to Tae-jun's world to notice things that were slightly off. The way certain people stood, the quality of attention they paid to things that shouldn't require attention. This man had been standing near the building entrance when she came home from her shift, which wasn't unusual, except that he was standing in the rain without a hood or an umbrella and looking at the building facade with the focused interest of someone who had a reason to look, rather than someone who was simply waiting. She walked past him without slowing, got inside, went upstairs. She stood in her apartment with her coat dripping onto the floor and thought carefully. It might be nothing. It was probably nothing. There were 100 reasons for a man to stand near a building in the rain. She thought about the legal documents, the 4 words at the bottom. She thought about the fact that Tae-jun knew where she was and had, to this point, done nothing with that knowledge except send money without conditions. She thought about the fact that in Tae-jun's world, doing nothing was an active decision that required ongoing enforcement. It wasn't a default state. It was something he had to choose and keep choosing, and not everyone who worked for him would make the same choice for the same reasons. She was 30 weeks pregnant. Moving again was not the same calculation it had been at 8 weeks. Moving again meant a new clinic, new records, a new context. It meant disruption to the prenatal care that had been finally, painstakingly, becoming consistent. It meant risk she could not fully calculate. She sat down at the kitchen table. She pressed both hands flat on the surface and made herself think instead of react. If she moved, she signaled panic. She also severed the one fragile thing that had been established, the understanding that he knew where she was and was choosing distance. A new disappearance would reset everything back to the start. Worse than the start, because now she was 30 weeks along and the calendar was not her ally. If she stayed inside a situation she didn't fully control, in proximity to whatever the man in the rain represented. She stayed. But she called Dolores downstairs the next morning and asked carefully if she had spoken recently to anyone unfamiliar about the building. Dolores thought about it. Yes, she said, last week. A property assessor, very polite. He had asked about the tenants, not by name, just generally. She had mentioned the young pregnant woman upstairs because he had asked if the building had families. Imani thanked her, went back upstairs. She sat very still for a long time. Then something she had been managing very successfully for the past 4 months stopped being manageable. It arrived all at once, the exhaustion, the fear, the particular loneliness of being 30 weeks pregnant and alone in a city that wasn't hers, navigating a situation that had no clean resolution, trying to protect a person who wasn't even born yet from consequences that belonged to an entirely different life. She put her head down on the kitchen table and pressed her forearms against the wood and breathed. She did not cry. She was past the point where crying felt like it would do anything. She just breathed and waited for the wave to pass, and when it did, she sat back up and looked at the wall. Then she picked up her phone. She did not call Tae-jun. She called Nari. She had Nari's number because Nari had put it in her phone herself, 14 months ago, during one of the 3 times they had met in person. Nari, who was bright and relentless, and had looked at Imani with the frankly assessing gaze of a woman who took accurate measurements of people rather than flattering ones, and had apparently decided Imani was worth keeping in contact with independently of whatever her brother did or didn't do. Nari picked up on the second ring. "I wondered when you'd call," she said. "Someone from his organization spoke to my neighbor," Imani said, without preamble. Someone presented themselves as a property assessor and asked about tenants in my building. A brief silence. When? Last week. Are you... Nari stopped. Are you safe right now? I'm not in danger. I'm fine. But Nari, I need to know if this was his call or someone operating outside his instructions. Because those are two completely different situations and I need to know which one I'm in. It wasn't his instruction. Nari's voice was flat and certain. I can tell you that absolutely. I don't know who it was, but it was not something he authorized. How can you be sure? Because he told me specifically, a month ago, that he had ordered everyone away from your location. That was not a casual mention. He made a point of telling me. Imani was quiet. He knows the test results, Nari said. He knows what the diagnosis actually means. Imani, he has had a very difficult 2 months, and I'm not asking you to feel sorry for him. I'm not asking you to do anything. I just want you to know that whatever happened with that person in your building, it was not him. Someone from his organization still showed up outside my building, Nari. I know. Someone from his world found me and walked up to my neighbor and asked about me. And I have 30 weeks of pregnancy and a daughter who is going to be here in 10 weeks. And I have been... Imani's voice caught, just slightly. She pressed it back down. I have been doing this alone. I have been doing this completely alone, and I understood why I was doing it alone, and I accepted that. But I cannot have his world show up at my building. I can't. I know, Nari said. She said it quietly and without filling the space after it with anything, which was the right thing to do. He needs to know that this happened, Imani said. I'm not asking you to carry messages, but he needs to know that someone from his organization found me and made contact with my building, and that I am aware of it, and that if anything like that happens again, I will. She stopped, because the sentence had run out of road. She didn't have a threat. She had no leverage. She had nothing to hold over Tae-jun except her own absence, which was apparently something he had found a way to live with for 4 months. I'll tell him, Nari said. Today. Thank you. Imani. A pause. How are you, actually? The question was so straightforward and so unarmed that Imani had no defense against it. She opened her mouth, closed it, looked at the wall. I'm tired, she said finally. I'm really tired. Nari was quiet for a moment. I know, she said. You don't have to be anything other than what you are right now. Imani hung up and sat at her kitchen table until the light in the window shifted from morning to afternoon. Tae-jun's phone rang at 4 in the afternoon. He saw Nari's name. He answered. She told him about the call, about the property assessor, about the neighbor, about what Imani had said, and how she had said it, not sparing him the detail, not softening it, because Nari had never done him the disservice of softening things that needed to be felt at their full weight. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said nothing for a moment. She called you, he said. She called me. She didn't call me. No. A pause. She called me because she needed information, and she didn't know if calling you would cost her something she wasn't willing to pay. She called me because she trusted me slightly more than she trusted the situation. Another pause. Tae-jun. She is 30 weeks pregnant and she is living alone in Portland, and someone from your organization made contact with her building without your authorization, and she handled it by calling me and asking the right questions instead of disappearing again. Do you understand what that means? Tae-jun understood exactly what it meant. It meant Imani Rowe, who had every reason to run, had chosen not to. Not yet. She had chosen to call and ask questions instead. That was a decision that cost her something. It was a decision that required her to risk something, the risk that what she heard back would be worse than what she feared, the risk that reaching out was itself a kind of vulnerability she wasn't sure she could afford. She had reached out anyway. He pressed 2 fingers against his mouth for a moment. Who did she reach when she called you, he said. What did she reach? What version of this? A woman who is trying very hard not to have this be worse than it already is, Nari said. Same as you. I need to go. Tae-jun. I'm not going to her. I'm not going anywhere near Portland. I need to go deal with the actual problem. He ended the call and stood up from the desk and felt the specific quality of fury he had been sitting on for 2 months. Finally reach a temperature where it was useful. The problem was not Seong-il, who had already been removed. The problem was a structural one. He had issued an instruction and explained the consequence and removed the person who violated it, and that should have been sufficient. But instructions had limits. Instructions required that the people receiving them understood not just the rule but the reason, and Tae-jun had never given anyone a reason. He had never explained what she was to him, because he had spent months unable to explain it to himself. He called Dong-hyun. "I need a full meeting, tonight, everyone at the senior level. I'll arrange it. I need to say something to the organization that I have never said before." He paused. "Prepare them for that." The meeting was at 8, 14 people in the room. The senior architecture of everything he had built over 15 years, sitting around a table in a building that had no official name on its lease. Tae-jun stood at the head of the table and looked at each person for a moment before he spoke. "There is a woman in Portland," he said. "She is carrying my child. Some of you have known something was different these past months, and none of you asked me directly, which I respect. I'm telling you now." He looked around the table. "She is not a contact. She is not a liability. She is not a subject of any kind of organizational interest. She is a private individual who has chosen to be absent from my life, and that is her right, and no one in this organization will interfere with that choice in any way, for any reason, under any interpretation of any instruction I have ever given." The room was very quiet. "If anyone takes independent action in her direction, any form of contact, any presence in that city connected to this organization, I will consider it an act against me personally, not against protocol, against me." He let that sit for exactly the right amount of time. "Are there questions?" Nobody had questions. He sat down. Dong-hyun, to his left, kept his face neutral and his eyes forward. The meeting ended. Tae-jun drove home alone. He sat in the parking garage for a few minutes before going inside. His hands were on the wheel. The engine ticked as it cooled. He had just told the most dangerous collection of people he knew that he was in love with a woman who had left him. He had put that information in the room and trusted that the people in it understood the weight of what he had just told them. He had made himself vulnerable in the one place where vulnerability had always been the thing most likely to get you killed. He had done it because it was the only honest move left. And sitting in that parking garage, he understood something he hadn't been able to articulate before. Every decision he had made since that night in the penthouse, the testing, the trust, the instruction to pull back, the meeting tonight, had been moving toward the same point, the same admission. And the admission was not that he had been wrong about the diagnosis, though he had been. The admission was not even that she was carrying his child, though she was. The admission was that he had destroyed something irreplaceable because he had been afraid of it. He had been afraid of what it meant to have something he could lose. And so he had lost it first, on his own terms, in the only way that felt like control. He had spent his entire life doing that. He got out of the car, went inside, went to his office, and sat at his desk and looked at the wall. He thought about Imani sitting at her kitchen table, 30 weeks pregnant in Portland, tired in a way she had said plainly and without embellishment, handling a situation he had created with the kind of exhausted competence that he recognized because it was the only mode she had. Not because she was unbreakable, but because breaking was something she didn't have the luxury of doing, and she knew it, and she had made her peace with it, and that made him feel like the specific kind of failure that no amount of money or structure or operational reorganization could address. He picked up a pen, turned it over in his hand. He opened the desk drawer. Inside was a photograph, not a copy, the original. The two pieces of the torn ultrasound placed side by side and held together with a single strip of clear tape. He had asked his attorney quietly if the pieces still existed. The attorney had confirmed they did. He had requested them. They had arrived in an envelope, and he had sat alone in his office and held the two halves together under his desk lamp for a long time, studying the small gray shadow on the white paper. He had taped them together himself. He was not sure why he had done it. He was not sure what it meant, other than that he had needed to do something with his hands that wasn't destructive. He looked at the taped photograph. He thought about what came next, not in the organizational sense, not in the strategic sense. He meant in the only sense that had ever actually mattered, and that he had spent his entire life refusing to prioritize. What came next for the person he was trying to become, and whether that person was someone Imani Rowe would ever be willing to let near her daughter. He didn't know the answer. That was the most terrifying thing he had encountered in 37 years of living in a world built specifically to provide answers through force. He put the photograph back in the drawer. He closed it carefully, and he waited. The storm came in from the coast on a Friday night in late March. Imani knew it was coming. She had been tracking weather patterns obsessively since January, partly because the walk from the bus stop to her building was 6 minutes on flat ground, and 6 minutes felt like 40 when you were 36 weeks pregnant in sideways rain, and partly because the habit of tracking things she couldn't control had become a way of managing the anxiety of all the things she also couldn't control. She watched the forecast the way some people watch stock prices, not because watching changed anything, but because knowing felt like its own form of preparation. She had her hospital bag packed. She had packed it at 34 weeks, 2 weeks ahead of every recommendation she had read, because she was the kind of person who needed the bag packed in order to stop thinking about the bag. It sat beside her bed. She looked at it every morning. It had become a fixed point. The way the taped-together ultrasound was a fixed point in Tae-jun's desk drawer 900 miles north. She did not know about the tape. She did not know he had done that. What she knew was that she was 36 weeks pregnant, that her body had been doing something strange and uncomfortable for 3 days that she had been telling herself was Braxton Hicks contractions, and that the storm moving in off the Pacific was projected to hit Portland at approximately 10 in the evening with sustained winds and heavy rain and the kind of pressure system that made everything feel slightly more ominous than it probably was. She made dinner at 6. She ate standing at the counter because sitting had become complicated. She cleaned up slowly, one hand braced against the counter's edge, her lower back sending up a steady complaint she had learned to partially ignore. She turned on the small television she had bought secondhand in January and watched 40 minutes of a cooking show without processing any of it. At 8:15, the contractions stopped being something she could tell herself were Braxton Hicks. She knew the difference because she had read about the difference approximately 40 times. And because her body, whatever else was happening to it, was giving her information she could not reasonably misinterpret. These were regular. They were building. They were coming with a rhythm that was accelerating rather than staying even. She was 36 weeks. That was considered early, but not dangerous. The clinic had told her at her last appointment that 36 weeks was a threshold, a premature birth, technically, but one where outcomes were generally good with proper medical support. Proper medical support meant getting to the hospital. She stood in the middle of her apartment for a moment, her hands on her stomach, breathing through something that crested and then subsided and left her exhaling slowly through her nose. Then she moved. She was not a person who panicked. That was both a strength and a thing that sometimes made her underestimate situations. She moved through the apartment with deliberate efficiency. Coat, bag, phone charger she nearly forgot, keys. She called a cab from her phone because the buses had already cut their night service due to the storm advisory. The cab app told her 11 minutes. She sat on the edge of her bed and breathed. Another contraction, stronger. She gripped the edge of the mattress and pressed through it and counted and released. The cab arrived in 9 minutes. The driver was a middle-aged man named Gerald, who took one look at her and immediately became the most focused driver she had ever encountered, running every light that was ambiguously yellow and navigating the rain-slicked streets with the concentrated quiet of someone who had decided this particular ride was not one to be slow about. "First one?" he said. "Yes," Imani managed. "Doing great," he said simply, and drove. The hospital was 12 minutes. Gerald made it in 8. He pulled up to the emergency entrance and put the car in park and turned on his hazard lights and got out to open her door without being asked. "Thank you," Imani said. "Go," he said. She went. The emergency intake moved quickly once she identified herself and explained. A nurse appeared. A wheelchair appeared. She was moving through corridors with fluorescent overhead light and the specific antiseptic smell of a medical facility at night, and she was alone. And she was not going to think about that right now because thinking about it would not help anything. She focused on the contractions, on breathing through them, on giving accurate answers to the questions the intake nurse was asking. Date of birth, weeks of gestation, any complications noted in prenatal care. She answered everything cleanly and precisely because this was the version of herself she needed right now, the version that functioned under pressure, that reduced everything to its necessary components, that did not require anything external to keep moving. She was admitted. She was taken to a room. A nurse named Patricia settled her in and checked her and told her she was at 5 centimeters, which meant this was happening, which Imani already knew. Is there anyone we should call? Patricia asked. Imani looked at the ceiling. No, she said. Then, after a moment, actually, she stopped. She lay there with the storm pushing rain against the window of the room and thought about what she was about to say and whether she meant it or whether it was the contractions making her think things she wouldn't think otherwise. She meant it. She had been thinking it for 6 weeks since the phone call to Nari, since the moment she had chosen not to run. She had been turning it over and looking at it from different angles for 6 weeks, and she had not been able to talk herself out of it. There's a number in my phone, she said, under Nari. Can you text her that I'm here? Just that. Just the hospital and that I'm here. Patricia took the phone, sent the message, handed it back. Imani closed her eyes and breathed and let the storm do what it was going to do outside. Nari's phone lit up at 9:47 p.m. She read the message twice. Then she called a number. Tae-jun answered on the first ring. I was awake. He was always awake at this hour. A habit that had become insomnia, that had become simply the way his nights worked. She's in labor, Nari said. Early. She's at the hospital in Portland. She sent me the name. The line was silent for exactly 2 seconds. Is she? She's admitted. That's all I know. She texted me the hospital name. She didn't ask for you. She didn't say don't come. She sent me the name of the hospital. Nari paused. I'm telling you what I know. I'm going. Tae-jun. I'm going, Nari. I know, she said. Drive carefully. He was in the car in 4 minutes. He did not call Dong-hyun. He did not call anyone. He got into the car alone with his phone in his jacket pocket and the address of a hospital in Portland pulled up on the screen, and he drove south into the storm. The rain was serious on I-5. Not dangerous, but serious. The kind of rain that required both hands on the wheel and genuine attention, that reduced visibility to the point where the road became a narrow tunnel of headlights and dark. He drove at exactly the speed the conditions allowed and not faster, which was the hardest thing he had done in months, because everything in him wanted to move faster, and there was no faster that was responsible, and he had made a decision, somewhere in the last several months, to stop making irresponsible choices for the sake of feeling like he was doing something. He thought about Imani in a hospital room. He thought about 36 weeks, which he knew was early, and what early meant, and what the range of outcomes looked like when a baby came at 36 weeks. He had read about this. He had read about fetal development with the same focused obsessiveness he applied to anything he needed to understand, which meant he had read about it thoroughly and in detail and could tell you exactly what a 36-week fetus weighed on average and what the lung development timeline looked like, and what the standard interventions were when a preterm birth presented complications. He drove and breathed and did not allow himself to catastrophize. He arrived at the hospital at 12:41 in the morning. He parked. He sat in the car for a moment with the engine off and the rain hammering the roof. He was wet from the walk between the parking structure and the entrance. He had not thought to bring an umbrella, which was the kind of detail that fell away when you were moving towards something that mattered. He went inside. He went to the desk. He gave his name and explained that he was the father of a patient currently in labor. He gave her name. He watched the desk attendant check the screen, check something else, and then look up with the neutral expression of someone who had been given instructions about this particular situation. The patient has indicated that she's aware you may arrive, the attendant said. She's asked that you wait in the family area on this floor. Is she? How is she? I can let the nurse know you're here and have her pass along an update. Please. He went to the family waiting area. He sat in a chair. The room was empty at this hour, except for an older man asleep in a corner seat with a coat pulled over him. The overhead lights were dimmed for the night shift. The windows showed nothing but rain and the dark shapes of the parking structure across the way. Tae-jun sat with his hands on his knees and his back straight and waited. This was the thing he had learned in the past several months that he had never known before. Waiting without leverage. Waiting without any mechanism to accelerate the outcome. Waiting in a room while something that mattered enormously happened without him, and having absolutely no instrument to deploy except his own presence and his own patience and the decision to stay without being asked to stay. A nurse appeared at 12:58. Not Patricia. Someone else. She looked at him with the measured assessment of someone who had been briefed. She knows you're here, the nurse said. She's at 7 centimeters. It's progressing. Is she okay? She's working hard. Baby's heart rate is good. She's doing well. Tae-jun nodded. The nurse started to leave. Tell her... He stopped. Started again. Just tell her I'm here. That's all. Don't tell her anything else. The nurse looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded and left. He sat back down. The hours moved the way hours move in hospitals at night. Not in a straight line, not at a consistent pace, but in a way that seemed to expand and compress unpredictably. 1:30 became 2:15 became 3 in a way that felt nothing like 90 minutes. At 3:20, the same nurse came back. She's asked if you want to come wait closer, the nurse said. He stood up immediately, then made himself stop. Closer meaning what? There's a chair outside her room, down the hall. She said you can sit there if you want. She's not asking you in. She's saying you can be nearby. He understood the distinction immediately and completely. It was not an invitation. It was a perimeter adjustment. It was Imani Rowe, in the middle of labor, in pain, exhausted, doing something that was costing her something, deciding that he could be closer but not inside, present but not included, nearby but not entitled to nearness. It was more than he had earned. He knew that. Yes, he said. I'll come. He followed the nurse down the corridor. She stopped outside a closed door and indicated the chair beside it. A standard waiting chair, the kind that existed in every hospital hallway in the country, plastic and utilitarian, and exactly what it needed to be. He sat in it. Through the closed door he could hear nothing clearly. Occasional movement, voices, the low-focused voices of medical staff. Once, clearly, a sound from Imani that was not a scream but was close to one. The sound of someone pushing through something that required everything they had. His hands gripped the front of his knees. He did not move. He did not stand. He did not knock on the door or reach for the handle or do any of the things that every instinct he had was demanding. He sat in the chair and breathed and stayed where he had been told he could stay. At 4:11 a.m., a baby cried. The sound came through the door, thin and immediate and absolutely unmistakable. Not the soft sounds he had read about, not a whimper, but a full-throated announcement of arrival, of presence, of the particular outrage of having been moved from one environment into a completely different one without consent, loud and indignant and alive. Tae-jun pressed his mouth against his clasped hands. He was shaking. He noticed it distantly, the way you notice weather through a window. His hands were shaking. His shoulders were shaking. He pressed his knuckles hard against his lips and stared at the door and breathed. Inside that room, beyond that door, Imani had just done the hardest thing she had ever done, and she had done it alone in every way that mattered, and there was a baby crying. He stayed in the chair. 15 minutes later, Patricia opened the door. She looked at him. Her face was not unkind. Healthy girl, she said. 5 pounds, 4 ounces. She's small, but she's breathing well. No immediate interventions needed. Tae-jun let out a breath that he had apparently been holding for longer than he realized. Imani? He said. Exhausted. She did well. Patricia looked at him steadily. She's asking for you. He stood. His knees were not entirely reliable. He put one hand briefly against the wall and then took it back. He went to the doorway. The room was dim. They had lowered the lights at some point during or after the birth. There were monitors and equipment and the organized aftermath of something that had required considerable effort. Patricia stayed near the door. Imani was in the bed. Her hair was damp against the pillow. Her face had the stripped, exposed quality of someone who had come through something that left them nothing to spare for performance. She was holding the baby against her chest. The baby was wrapped in a standard hospital blanket and was not crying anymore. She was simply there, present, breathing. Imani looked at him from across the room. She did not say anything immediately. She looked at him the way you look at something you have been thinking about for a long time when you finally see it in person, checking it against the version you've been carrying internally, making adjustments. He stood in the doorway. He did not move closer. He waited. You drove in that storm, she said finally. Yes. Alone? Yes. She looked at him for another moment. Then she looked down at the baby on her chest. Come here, she said, quietly. Not warmly. That wasn't available yet, and they both knew it. But not coldly either. With something that was perhaps closest to gravity. like she was acknowledging a force that existed whether she managed it or not. He crossed the room. He stopped at the bedside. He looked at the baby. At the small face, which was doing what newborn faces do, processing, adjusting, being in the world for the first time with eyes that couldn't fully focus yet, but were trying. His chest was doing something he had no vocabulary for. "She's early," Imani said. "The nurse told me she's breathing well." "She is." A pause. "She's stubborn. She wasn't supposed to come yet." "She decided." "Yeah." Imani exhaled slowly. "She decided." They were quiet for a moment. The monitors beeped softly. Outside, the storm was still going, rain against the window in irregular waves. "I got the documents," Imani said. "I know." "I didn't contact you." "I know." I wasn't ready to contact you. I'm still not sure I'm ready." She looked at him directly. "I let Nari tell you I was here. That's what I was ready for." "I understand. I don't want you to think that because I let you come here, I've decided something. I haven't decided anything. I'm 36 weeks. I was 36 weeks. She's here now. And I'm in a hospital, and I'm tired, and She stopped. Her jaw tightened briefly. "I didn't want to be alone for this. That's what I decided. That I didn't want to be alone for this specific part." "Okay," Tae-jun said. "That's not forgiveness." "I know it's not." She looked at him. He held her eyes and did not look away and did not try to fill the space with anything that would have been easier than the silence. "Do you want to hold her?" Imani said. The question was so direct and so unornamented that it took him a second to register it. He had not expected it. Not yet. Not tonight. He looked at the baby on her chest, at the small bundle of blanket and presents. "Yes," he said, "if you're willing." Imani looked down at the baby for a moment. Then she shifted, carefully, and held the baby out toward him with the focused deliberateness of someone handing over something they are not entirely sure they should hand over. He reached for her. He had almost no experience with infants. He knew this about himself. He corrected his hands based on the position of Imani's as she transferred the weight. The baby weighed almost nothing and entirely everything. She was warm through the blanket. She smelled the way he had not known to expect, something clean and fundamental, something that had no parallel in anything he had experienced before. Her eyes were closed now. Her face was very small. Her hands, curled inside the blanket's edge, were impossibly small. He had never in his life felt his chest behave the way it was behaving right now. His knees were doing something uncertain. He was aware of this abstractly, distantly, the way you are aware of structural things in your body when your mind is entirely elsewhere. He lowered himself carefully to sit on the edge of a chair that Patricia had quietly positioned beside the bed, at some point without him noticing. He sat with his daughter in his arms. He could not speak. I was aware that he could not speak, and that this was not a performance. He had nothing theatrical about him right now, nothing strategic, nothing arranged. He was a man sitting in a hospital chair in a storm with a 5-pound person in his arms who had existed in the world for approximately 40 minutes, and he had no instruments for this. The baby moved, just slightly. A shift, a small adjustment, a hand uncurling against the blanket. His eyes were burning. He blinked. Hard. Imani was watching him. He became aware of this and looked up, expecting. He didn't know what he was expecting. Judgment, distance. The particular expression of someone observing a person get what they didn't deserve. Instead, she was looking at him with something he couldn't fully categorize. Not forgiveness. She had said that clearly, and he believed her. But something else. Recognition, maybe. The acknowledgement of something real happening in front of her that she couldn't pretend wasn't real. "I'm sorry," he said. His voice came out wrong, rough and low and stripped of everything he would normally use to manage how he sounded. Imani looked at him. "I know," she said. "That's not enough." "No," she agreed. "It's not." He looked back down at the baby, at the closed eyes and the small nose and the barely visible rise and fall of her chest. "I was afraid," he said. Not as an excuse, as the most accurate statement he could make about what had happened. I was afraid of what it meant to have something I could lose. He stopped. "I have spent my entire life making sure that I was the one who decided what stayed and what didn't, Because if I decided, it wasn't something that could be taken. He looked up. And when you came to me with that photograph, I was terrified. Not of you. Not of... I was terrified of what I felt, and I destroyed it before I could feel it. Imani's face was very still. I know that doesn't give back the months, he said. I know it doesn't give back any of it. No, she said, it doesn't. They sat in the quiet. The baby breathed, the monitors beeped. The storm outside was beginning, very slightly, almost imperceptibly, to ease. What's her name? Tae-jun asked. Imani was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about it for weeks. I didn't want to decide completely alone. She paused. But I also wasn't going to wait indefinitely. That's fair. I was thinking, Nia, she said. It means purpose. It means the reason for something. He repeated it quietly, testing the weight of it. Nia. Yeah. It's right, he said. Imani looked at her daughter in his arms for a long moment. Then she extended her hands, and he transferred the baby back carefully, and Imani settled her against her chest and adjusted the blanket with the instinctive precision of someone doing something her body already knew how to do. We go slowly, Imani said. Whatever this is. Whatever you're trying to do. We go slowly. As slowly as you need. I'm not making promises tonight. I'm not deciding anything tonight. I'm telling you that you can come to the next appointment if I invite you. I'm telling you that I will call Nari if I need something and Nari can tell you. I'm telling you that is what I have right now. I'll take it, Tae-jun said, without hesitation, without negotiation. I know you think that now. I know it now, he said. I'll know it in 6 months. I'll know it in a year. I'm not going to stop knowing it because it gets difficult. Imani looked at him for a long moment. People say that, she said. I know they do. And then the situation gets difficult, and they stop meaning it. I know. So what makes you different? He thought about it. He did not answer immediately, which she seemed to notice, the fact that he didn't reach for a ready answer. Nothing, he said finally. Right now, nothing makes me different except what I do next, and what I do after that, and what I do after that. He paused. I don't have proof. I have tonight. And tonight I'm sitting in a hospital chair in Portland at 4 in the morning after driving through a storm because I am done. He stopped. His voice had gone rough again. He collected it. I am done being the man who destroys things because he's afraid of them. Imani looked at him. The room was quiet. Nia breathed against her chest. The storm rattled the window once, hard, and then subsided. Imani did not respond. Not immediately. She looked at him with that same careful, measuring look she had given him when he walked in, checking the internal version against the real one. Then she closed her eyes. You should stay, she said. Not warmly. Not as an invitation to anything beyond what the words meant. Until morning. You'd have drove it a long way. Yes, he said. There's a chair by the window. I see it. He moved to the chair by the window. He sat in it. Outside, the storm was definitely easing now. The rain still coming, but lighter, the worst of it moving east across the city. He did not sleep. He sat with his hands on his knees and watched the woman he had failed holding the daughter he had almost never had, and he breathed and he stayed. At some point, Imani fell asleep with Nia on her chest. A nurse came in quietly and transferred the baby to the bassinet beside the bed and checked the monitors and left without waking either of them. Tae-jun sat by the window. Dawn came slowly, gray and wet and tentative, the way Pacific Northwest mornings come after storms, as if the sky is not entirely certain the night is finished. Light filled the room incrementally. The monitors beeped. Nia slept in her bassinet. Imani slept in her bed. Tae-jun sat in his chair and watched the light change and thought about purpose, the meaning Imani had given her daughter's name, and what it required of a person to actually deserve one. He had spent his life being a man who took things. He was going to have to become, from this point forward, a man who gave them instead. He did not know if he was capable of it. He knew that not knowing and still choosing it was the only honest place to begin. Outside, Seattle waited for him. The organization waited. The restructuring he had started waited for completion. Dong-hyun waited. The legitimate businesses he had begun consolidating waited for decisions. His entire constructed life waited for him to come back and finish what he had started. He would go back. He would finish it. But he sat for one more hour in that gray Portland dawn, in a hospital chair beside a window, while Nia Seo breathed her way into her first morning. And for the first time in 37 years, Seo Tae-jun chose to stay in a moment rather than control what came next. Nia was 6 days old when Imani brought her home to the Portland apartment. Tae-jun had offered, carefully and without pressure, to arrange something larger. A house, or at least a proper apartment, somewhere with more than 340 square feet, somewhere with heat that actually worked and windows that didn't rattle when the wind came off the coast. He had made the offer once, in the hospital, on the morning of the second day, phrasing it with the deliberate neutrality of someone who had practiced removing the weight of expectation from his voice. Imani had looked at him with the steady, level expression of someone who had anticipated exactly this and had already decided. "No," she said. "Not yet." He had not asked again. He drove her home from the hospital because she allowed it. He carried the car seat up the narrow stairs of the building above the laundromat. He set it down inside the door and looked at the apartment, at the space heater borrowed from the woman downstairs, at the second-hand furniture, at the book on the nightstand with its spine slightly thickened from what was stored inside it, at the single window with its view of wet rooftops and a fire escape going nowhere interesting. He saw all of it. He said nothing about any of it. "Thank you," Imani said. She was standing just inside the door with Nia against her chest, still in the going-home outfit that Nari had sent to the hospital without being asked, yellow with feet, which Nia occupied approximately 2/3 of. "Do you need anything before I go?" "I'm okay." He nodded. He looked at Nia one more time. She was sleeping with the absolute commitment of someone who had recently undergone an ordeal and required substantial recovery. Her face was very small against Imani's chest. "I'll call Nari," Imani said, "if I need something." "I know." He left. He walked down the stairs and out through the laundromat entrance and into air that had finally, in the days since the storm, gone clear and cold and direct. He sat in his car. He did not start the engine for a few minutes. Then he drove north. The drive back to Seattle was 2 hours and 40 minutes of winter sun on wet roads, the kind of light that illuminates without warming, that makes everything visible without making anything easier to look at. He drove with both hands on the wheel and a list in his head. Not a list of things he wanted, but a list of things he was going to do, in the order he was going to do them, with the specific discipline he had been applying to the reorganization of himself for the past 4 months. He had learned, in those 4 months, that discipline applied to the self was harder than discipline applied to anything external. An organization had clear inputs and outputs. You could measure compliance. You could verify results. The self had no such clarity. The self was resistant and recursive and capable of extraordinary self-deception, and the only check on that deception was the willingness to keep looking directly at the thing you most wanted to look away from. He had been looking at it, every day. Sometimes it was the first thing he did in the morning, sat in his office before anyone else arrived and reviewed, without mercy or excuse, the record of what he had done and what it had cost. He was not finished looking at it. He suspected he would not be finished for a long time. That was acceptable. Looking was the work. The work did not have an endpoint. He drove north while his daughter slept in a small apartment above a laundromat, and the road unrolled ahead of him, and Seattle waited. The organizational restructuring took 4 months to complete properly. It was not dramatic. Men who expected drama, who were watching for the moment when Tae-jun's withdrawal would create a power vacuum they could move into, found instead a transition so thoroughly prepared and deliberately executed that there was nothing to exploit. Dong-hyun absorbed operational control the way water absorbs into ground that has been prepared to receive it, completely, without spectacle, leaving no pooling on the surface. Tae-jun spent those 4 months in a specific kind of limbo, present enough to ensure the transition held, absent enough that the organization began operating according to its new gravity rather than his. It required a precision of calibration he found genuinely difficult. Too present, and he undermined the transfer. Too absent, and the structure he had carefully built would flex in ways he couldn't correct from a distance. He managed it, not perfectly. There were 2 situations in February that required his direct intervention, conversations he had with specific individuals that were brief and unambiguous, and left no room for subsequent reinterpretation. After those conversations, the situations resolved. No one tested the structure again in a way that required him. By late March, he was no longer needed operationally. He was still present in the way that any significant historical force remains present in the institutions it shaped, as context, as precedent, as the reason certain decisions had already been made. But the daily machinery ran without him. He did not feel the relief he had expected. He felt something more complicated, the specific vertigo of a person who has defined themselves by a function for so long that removing the function reveals how little of themselves remained underneath it. He had known this was coming. He had read enough in the long, sleepless hours since November to understand what happens to identity when its primary structure is removed. He sat in his office on a Thursday afternoon in late March, the operational files closed on his desk, the building quiet around him, and felt the vertigo and did not try to fill it with anything. He let it be what it was. Then he got up and went to find something to do with his hands that was not destruction. What? He started with the legitimate businesses. The real estate holding company needed 3 months of intensive restructuring to separate its clean assets from the ones whose origins required careful handling. He worked with his attorney on the documentation, with accountants on the financial architecture, with 2 compliance specialists who understood the nature of the work without requiring explicit explanation. It was detailed and tedious, and occasionally required him to sit with information about his own past that was uncomfortable to hold in clean fluorescent office light. He held it anyway. He made the decisions that the information required. Some assets could not be cleaned, only contained. He contained them as tightly as the law and his own willingness allowed, and he moved on. The logistics firm was cleaner. It had been operating legitimately for 6 years, its staff composed almost entirely of people who didn't know and didn't need to know the full history of its founding capital. He left it structurally intact, adjusted the ownership documentation, and arranged for the profits to flow in directions that would eventually reach Nia through the trust he had established. He was building something. That was how he had started thinking about it. Not dismantling, but building. The dismantling was the foundation work. What he was building on top of it was a different kind of structure, one where a child could grow up without inheriting the weight of what her father had done to accumulate the ground she stood on. He didn't know if he could make it clean enough. He suspected he couldn't entirely. There were things he had done that had no structural fix. They simply existed in the record of his life as things he had done. He was going to have to carry them. What he could control was what happened going forward, and he controlled it with the same precision he had once applied to the organization. Nairi called every week. Sometimes she talked about Imani directly, brief, factual updates that she offered without editorializing, knowing he would take them the way water takes what's given to it. Sometimes she talked about Nia, who was gaining weight appropriately and had Nari's considerable approval. She looked at me, Nari reported in April, when she had driven up to Portland for a weekend. Directly. For a long time. Like she was filing me. She files everything, Tae-jun said. He knew this from the hospital, from the 2 days he had sat in a chair by the window watching a brand new person take inventory of the world. She has your attention span, Nari said, which means she's either going to be extremely focused or she's going to be impossible to distract from something dangerous. Both, probably. Definitely both. A pause. Imani is doing better. She's less exhausted. She hired someone to help 3 mornings a week. She didn't want to, but she eventually did. Good. She asked about you. He was quiet. Not, don't make it into something. She asked how the transition was going, whether it was done, whether you were... Nari paused. Whether you were okay. He pressed his mouth together, exhaled through his nose. Tell her I'm okay. Tell her yourself. She's not going to break from a phone call. He didn't call. Not yet. He wasn't ready to calibrate that correctly, and he was learning to recognize the difference between avoidance and timing, even when the two looked similar from the outside. He wrote a letter instead, not sent, never sent, just written in the middle of the night on paper because some things needed to be written before they could be said, and some of them never needed to be said at all. The letter was 2 pages. He read it the following morning and put it in the desk drawer with the taped photograph. He was building a record of honesty that no one would ever see. He understood that this was not efficient. He did it anyway because it was keeping him tethered to something true. The first invitation came in May. A pediatric appointment. Imani sent the time and address through Nari, which was still the operating system, and he showed up 9 minutes early and stood on the sidewalk outside the clinic with his hands in his coat pockets and waited. He watched her come down the street with the stroller. She moved differently than she had in Seattle, he noticed. Something in her posture had changed. She was still guarded, still precise, still the particular brand of self-contained that had always been recognizably her. But the tautness was different, less like bracing, more like someone who had found the distribution of weight that allowed them to keep moving without burning everything. He fell into step beside her. She looked at him briefly. A check. Then forward again. She's been awake since 5, Imani said. Difficult morning? Average morning. A pause. She wanted to discuss the ceiling fan at length. She mentioned it to me at the hospital. She had opinions. She always has opinions. Imani glanced at the stroller where Nia was currently examining her own knuckle with the focus of a researcher encountering a new specimen. She just can't say them yet. She makes up for it with volume. The appointment was efficient. A pediatrician named Dr. Reyes, who had the calm, thorough manner of someone who genuinely liked infants and didn't need to perform it. She measured Nia, assessed her, asked questions that Imani answered with the precise recall of someone who had been paying close attention to every detail. When Dr. Reyes turned to Tae-jun and asked about family medical history, he answered completely and without deflecting, including the fertility treatment, the medication, the timeline. It was information that could matter for Nia's healthcare history. He was not going to be incomplete about it. Imani was looking at the wall when he answered. Her jaw moved slightly. Then she looked back at Dr. Reyes. Walking out afterward, Nia in the stroller between them, Imani said, "You didn't have to say all of that. The doctor needed accurate information." I know that." She was quiet for a moment. I know." They walked. The May air was cool and the trees were doing what trees did in May in the Pacific Northwest. All in at once, as if they had been waiting. Green everywhere, sudden and total. "She has your chin," Imani said. He looked at her. "I've been looking at it for 2 months," she said. "I kept not saying it, but it's your chin. She did not get that from me." She glanced at the stroller. "Everything else is up for debate. That part is yours." He looked down at Nia. She had moved on from her knuckle and was now examining the stroller's sun canopy with the same serious investment. "She's going to be difficult," Imani said. "She already is." "She comes by it honestly," he said. Imani made a sound. Not quite a laugh, something adjacent, something that passed briefly through her face and was gone, but had definitely been there. They walked half a block more in the particular comfortable silence that had, without either of them formally constructing it, begun to exist between them. It was different from the silences they'd had before. Those had been full of things they were managing. This one was something closer to neutral. Not resolved, not easy, but not requiring active management. "You could come to the next one," she said, without the relay. He kept his pace even, his face arranged. "I'd like that. Don't make it into more than what it is." "It's a pediatric appointment," he said. "It's exactly what it is." She looked at him. He met her eyes and held them without adding anything to the look, without layering any of the things he was feeling on top of it. Just his eyes, just present. She looked forward again. "Okay," she said. June passed. July. August. He came to appointments. He came to evenings that were not anything other than evenings. Imani cooked, he ate, he held Nia while Imani ate, he washed the dishes without being asked, and she stopped objecting to it somewhere around the 4th time. He learned the specific sequence required to stop Nia's 3 a.m. objections to the universe. A particular rhythm, a low, continuous sound, a specific angle of hold that he had found by accident and then refined across multiple sleepless visits until he could execute it reliably. He did not stay overnight. He did not bring gifts after the first time, when Imani's look at the gift, practical, genuinely practical, a thing Nia needed, had communicated clearly that the gesture was a pattern she was identifying and not accepting. He showed up with himself. That was all. And the discipline required to make that all, to not supplement it with resources or gestures, or the machinery he had spent his life reaching for, was the hardest discipline he had ever maintained. He was getting better at it, incrementally. in the way that you get better at a language by speaking it badly until the bad parts start to fall away. He had begun to understand something that had not been available to him in November, or February, or even May. He had begun to understand that what he was doing now, the showing up, the consistency, the maintenance of presence without pressure, was not a campaign. It was not a strategy with an objective at the end of it. It was simply what being a person who could be trusted looked like, expressed over time, in the only way it could be expressed, by doing it. Again and again. Without expectation that the doing would be acknowledged or rewarded or even noticed. Some days she noticed. Some days she was exhausted and Nia was difficult, and the evening was functional rather than anything else. And he drove home knowing that what he had contributed to that evening was practical rather than meaningful, and that was fine. That was allowed. Relationships were not sustained by their best moments. They were sustained by their ordinary ones. He was learning ordinary. He was 40 years old and learning ordinary for the first time. In September, Imani brought out the ultrasound. She had cooked rice and a stew that filled the small Portland apartment with warmth and the smell of something her mother had apparently made when she was sick as a child, which she had never mentioned before. Nia was in the bouncy chair on the kitchen floor, engaged in a serious, ongoing relationship with her own left hand. Tae-jun was washing dishes when he heard Imani come out of the bedroom. He turned, dried his hands. She had the two pieces on the kitchen table, not aligned, just placed there, the torn edges visible, the image in two separate halves. He looked at them, then at her. "I kept them," she said. "That night. I bent down and picked them up, and I don't know why. I wasn't thinking about keeping them. My hands just did it, and then I couldn't—" She stopped. "I couldn't throw them away." "I know," he said. "I know you kept them." She looked at him. "How?" He went to his jacket over the chair. He reached into the inner pocket and removed what had been there since February. He set it on the table beside her two pieces. The same photograph. Taped. Both halves aligned and held with a single strip of clear tape down the center. Imani looked at his version for a long time, then at her separated pieces, then at him. "You had them," she said. "I asked my attorney to retrieve them from the office, the night I left." He paused. "I don't fully know why. I just knew I couldn't leave them on the floor." "You taped it?" "Yes." She picked up the taped version, held it under the kitchen light, looked at the tape line running down the center, at the image on both sides of it, the small gray form, the measurement markers, the printed date, at the proof that something had existed before it was destroyed. She set it down. She picked up her two loose pieces. She held them together, edges touching, and the image assembled itself, incomplete, the gap between the halves slightly imprecise, because torn paper never realigns exactly. She put them back down. She looked at both versions side by side, his taped reconstruction and her two loose pieces, for a long time. "Tell me what you were feeling," she said, "that night. Not what you were thinking, what you were feeling." He sat down. The kitchen chair was wood and slightly uneven. He placed his hands flat on the table. "Terror," he said. She waited. "Not of you. Not of—" It wasn't suspicion, the way I said it was. The suspicion was what I reached for because it was manageable. Because suspicion was something I knew how to handle. He looked at his hands. What I actually felt when you held out that photograph was terror. Because I looked at that image and I understood immediately what it would mean to love something that small. And I understood. He stopped. Organized. I understood that everything I had built my life to prevent was happening. Something I couldn't protect. Something that could be used against me. Something that, if I let myself love it, would be the most vulnerable thing I had ever had. "So you destroyed it." "So I destroyed it." He looked at her. "Before it could become a loss, before something else could take it. That was the only kind of control I had left, so I used it." Imani held his eyes. She was very still. In the bouncy chair, Nia had moved on from her hand and was examining the edge of the chair's tray with equal seriousness. "My mother told me something when I was 17, Imani said. She said, the most dangerous man isn't the one who hurts you on purpose. It's the one who hurts you because he's afraid, because he doesn't know what else to do with fear, because at least the first one knows what he's doing." He didn't look away from her. I spent months in Portland trying to figure out which one you were, she said. I kept going back and forth. I'd decide one thing and then I'd remember something else about you. Something specific, some ordinary detail, and I'd have to start over. She looked at the table, at the photograph in its two versions. The thing I kept coming back to was the night my mother called. When she was in the hospital, you didn't say anything. You didn't try to fix it. You just stayed in the room with me while it was bad. And I thought, a man who hurts on purpose doesn't do that. A man who hurts on purpose leaves the room when it costs him something. I stayed, he said quietly, and then you tore a photograph of your daughter in half and told me to get out. Her voice didn't crack. It was simply direct. So you see the problem? Yes. Both things are true. You are both men. She looked at him. And I spent a long time trying to decide which one was the real one, and I eventually figured out that's the wrong question. They're both real. You're both of them. And the question is which one you're going to be tomorrow. He sat with that. He did not rush past it. I know which one I'm trying to be, he said. I know you do. She reached out and touched the tape line on the photograph. One finger running along the center. This is still broken. Yes. The tape doesn't make it whole, it just holds the pieces in the same place. Yes. She picked the taped photograph up. She went to the bedroom. She came back with the drugstore frame she had been using in this apartment. Simple, wood, nothing selected for meaning. She opened the back. She placed the taped photograph inside. She closed it. She looked around the kitchen and placed it on the shelf where it could be seen from the table, from the counter, from wherever you were standing. She stepped back and looked at it. The tape line was clearly visible through the glass. The tear in the original paper, held by the tape, was visible too. Not hidden, not minimized. Just there. Part of the image. I'm not framing it because we're fine, she said. I know. I'm framing it because neither of us gets to forget what it cost. I know that too. In the bouncy chair, Nia looked up from the tray's edge and found both of them looking at the shelf. She followed their gaze, appeared to locate the frame, regarded it for a moment with her standard inventory expression, and then looked back at her tray, having apparently filed the information. Tae-jun crouched down to her level. She turned her attention to him immediately, the full, unfiltered attention of someone who had not yet learned to be strategic about where they looked. He held out one finger. She examined it. Then, with the deliberate gravity of a significant decision, she reached out and wrapped her hand around it. He stayed very still. His chest was doing the thing it did. He was not going to try to describe the thing it did because he had given up trying to describe it. He had simply accepted that his daughter's hand around his finger was an experience for which he did not have adequate language, and that this was fine, and that some things were allowed to exist beyond language. Imani was watching. He didn't look up. He stayed on the kitchen floor with Nia's hand around his finger and let the moment be what it was. After a while, Imani said, "She's going to walk early. I can already tell. She's going to figure it out, and then we're going to have a very different set of problems." How early? I don't know. Nari says the average is... Nari has been researching infant motor development. Nari has been researching everything about Nia since approximately day 3. She sent me a 17-page summary of developmental milestone research in February. 17 pages. She included a bibliography. Imani sat down on the floor on the other side of Nia. She's very invested. She's the same way about everything she cares about, Tae-jun said. She's always been like that. I know, I like it. A pause. I like her. She likes you. She likes Nia. I'm the vehicle. She liked you before Nia, he said. She told me 14 months ago, before any of this, that you were... She said you were the first person I'd brought into my life that she didn't want to warn. Imani looked at him. Warn, she repeated. She's protective. She's always assessed the people around me for risk. And she assessed me and decided not to warn me. She decided you could handle what you were getting into. She was wrong, it turned out, because she didn't know what I was going to do. But the assessment of you was accurate. Imani was quiet for a moment. Nia had released his finger and was now attempting to use it as a teething surface, which he permitted because it gave her something to focus on. I need to tell you something, Imani said. He looked at her. When I left Seattle, when I was driving south on I-5 at 4 in the morning with one suitcase and cash and your broken photograph in my pocket. She looked at the floor between them. I was not as okay as I behaved like I was. I want you to know that. I spent 8 months being very functional, and I was very functional. And I'm also telling you that I was not okay. I was frightened for a long time. Not of what you would do, of what I had to do alone, of whether I was enough. She looked up. I am enough. I know that. I've always known that about myself. But knowing something and not being frightened by it are different things. Yes, he said. I want you to know it was hard. Because I think you need to know that. Not so that you feel worse about it. You already feel what you feel about it, and that's yours to carry. But because I don't want to be... She paused, selecting words carefully. I don't want to be the person who was fine. I was not fine. I was capable, and I was not fine, and those two things happened at the same time. He held her eyes. I know, he said. I know you weren't fine. I know what I made you navigate alone. I'm going to know that for the rest of my life. Good, she said. Not harshly, just clearly. I need you to know it. I do. Nia, evidently tired of the finger's texture, released it and looked at both of them again with the expression that said she was taking note. Imani told him she was thinking about moving in October. She told him at the kitchen table, both of them with coffee going cold beside them, Nia napping in the other room with the monitor on the table between them. She told him she didn't want to stay in Portland, not because of anything current, but because Portland would always be the place she had run to. She needed to live somewhere she had chosen. She was thinking about Seattle. He did not react immediately. He waited until he was certain his face was accurate and not performing, and then he said, "What would that look like?" "My apartment. My name. My... everything mine." She looked at him. "Close enough that the appointments don't require the relay anymore. Close enough that Nia has access to both of us without a 2-hour drive as the precondition. Close enough for what we are now," he said carefully, "not what we might become." "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "Can you work with that distinction?" "I've been working with it for 8 months. Working with it from 2 hours away is different from working with it from 10 minutes away. I know the difference." He held her eyes. "I can maintain the distinction. I have no interest in pressure. I have never been interested in pressure with you. What I did in November was not pressure. It was something worse, and I know that. But what I'm doing now is not pressure. What I'm doing now is showing up when you ask me to and leaving when you don't. And if I'm in Seattle, you're going to want to show up more." "Yes. I'm not going to pretend otherwise." She was quiet for a moment. "I need you to tell me directly, Tae-jun. If I'm in Seattle and we're doing this, the appointments, the evenings, the..." She gestured at the kitchen, at the apartment, at the version of this that had been building for months. "If we're doing this and it's not moving where you want it to move, if you get to a point where the distinction becomes something you can't hold, can you tell me? Instead of doing something else with it." "Yes," he said, "because that's the thing I'm most afraid of. Not the distance, not the practicalities. The thing I'm afraid of is that we build something that looks like trust, and then you reach your limit of waiting and you handle it the way you handle things. Imani, I'm telling you what I'm afraid of. I know, I'm not..." He stopped, looked at the table, looked back at her. "I'm not going to promise you perfect. I'm not going to tell you I've been fixed. I'm telling you that I have been paying attention for 8 months to what I actually am and what it costs other people. And I'm telling you that I understand more clearly than I've understood anything, that what you're describing, the ability to say it instead of doing something else with it, is not optional. It's the minimum. It's the floor." He held her gaze. "I can maintain a floor." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Okay?" He did not press on the word. He let it be what it was. They moved to Seattle in February. Not together. Imani found an apartment in Capitol Hill, her search, her criteria, her name on the lease. She furnished it herself mostly, except for a kitchen table that Nari found and delivered with the satisfied efficiency of someone who had been waiting for permission to be useful. The apartment had good light and a courtyard and a building manager who fixed things when they broke, which Imani had listed as a non-negotiable requirement based on experience. Tae-jun did not help her find it. He did not offer financial assistance for it, understanding that the apartment needed to be fully hers in a way that his money could compromise without either of them intending it. When she moved in, he came on the second day, after Nari had already been there for a full Saturday of furniture assembly and shelf argumentation, and he put together the crib that had defeated the instructions, and he sat on the floor with Nia while the kitchen was organized, and then he left. He left at 6:30 that evening, walking out into a February Seattle night that had the cold, specific quality of the city in winter. Not brutal, but persistent, the kind of cold that settles into the spaces between things. He walked to his car and sat in it and thought about the fact that Imani was 10 minutes away. Not 2 hours. 10 minutes. He was aware of what this meant and what it did not mean, and he held both things simultaneously, and he drove home. The conversation that changed the shape of everything happened in March. Not dramatically. Nothing that changed the shape of things between Imani and Tae-jun happened dramatically, because she had set the terms of engagement in a hospital room at 4 in the morning, and those terms, slowly, at my pace, no performance, had governed everything since. The conversations that mattered happened at kitchen tables and on apartment floors and in clinic hallways. They happened in ordinary containers. This one happened on a Sunday. Nia was napping. Imani had been quiet all morning in the particular way that meant she was carrying something she was deciding whether to say. He waited. He had gotten better at waiting. Finally, over lunch, she said, "I called my mother last week." He looked up. "I told her about you. About Nia. About all of it, the whole version." She looked at her plate. She didn't yell. I was prepared for yelling. She asked a lot of questions, and then she was quiet for a while, and then she said, "Does he know what he did?" "What did you tell her?" I told her yes. I told her he knows, and he's been living with it for over a year. She paused. She asked if you'd apologized. I told her you had. She asked what the apology looked like. I told her it looked like showing up and doing the right thing without asking for credit. Imani was quiet for a moment. She said, "That's the only kind worth anything." He didn't speak. "She wants to meet Nia," Imani said. "She's been wanting to since November. I was waiting until I knew what I was telling her, about the situation, about what we were." She looked at him. "I didn't know what to call it." "What did you call it?" She was quiet for a moment. "I told her we were figuring it out. I told her the truth, which is that I don't know what this is yet, but I know it's real, and I know it's not finished, and I know I'm not afraid of it anymore." The kitchen was very still. Nia breathed in the other room, audible through the monitor. Outside, Seattle was doing something tentative with late winter light, offering a little, withdrawing it, offering again. "Are you still afraid of me?" he said. Not accusatory. It was an honest question. She thought about it honestly. Not the way I was, I'm not afraid you're going to do what you did. I don't think you're that person anymore. Or at least I think you're that person less, and that the part of you that is in a smaller room than it used to be. She met his eyes. What I'm afraid of now is simpler. I'm afraid of caring about something this much and having it be ordinary. Having it be two people trying to be good to each other and sometimes failing. Having it be not a story, just a life. "That's what I'm offering," he said. "A life, not a story." "I know." She looked at her hands. "I know that's actually better. I'm working on believing it." "Take the time you need." She looked up at him sharply. He almost smiled. "I know, 4th time." "It's also still true," she said quietly. And then, for the first time, she reached across the kitchen table and put her hand over his. Just for a moment. Just long enough to be real. Then she pulled it back and picked up her fork, and they finished lunch. Nia was 7 months old when she sat up on her own. She did it on a blanket in the Capitol Hill apartment on a morning in April when the light came through the windows at the precise angle that meant spring had finally committed. She had been working toward it for weeks. The precursor movements, the failed attempts, the expression of intense concentration that preceded every developmental leap. And then she did it. She sat up, solid and upright and immediately satisfied with herself. Tae-jun was in the chair across the room. He was there because Imani had called the previous evening and said come for breakfast, which was a new category of invitation, the first morning one. He had come. He had eaten at her table. And now he was watching his daughter solve a problem she had been working on for weeks. Nia looked up when she succeeded. She looked at Imani, who was on the floor beside her. She looked at Tae-jun in the chair. Her expression said, "I have done a thing. You may acknowledge this." Both of them laughed at exactly the same moment. Not planned, not performed, just the same laugh, triggered by the same thing, at the same time. Nia accepted this acknowledgement as appropriate and immediately attempted to demonstrate again, went sideways, was caught by Imani's hands. Tae-jun was off the chair and on the floor without any decision occurring between the impulse and the action, the three of them on the blanket. Nia undeterred by the sideways, already working on sitting up again. Imani's hands supporting her back. Tae-jun close enough that his shoulder was nearly touching Imani's. Neither of them moved away. The morning light lay across the apartment floor in long, flat lines. Through the window, a tree in the courtyard had gone completely green in the way trees do when they are finally serious about it. Someone in the building above was playing music. Low, indistinct, just enough to exist. Nia sat up again, held it, looked at them. Tae-jun reached out his hand. He placed it on the blanket between himself and Imani. Palm up. Open. Not reaching, just available. Imani looked at it. She took her time. She looked at it the way she looked at everything she was making a real decision about, without rushing, without pretending she didn't know what the decision cost. Then she placed her hand in his, not intertwined, not a grip, her hand in his palm, resting, his fingers closing gently around it. Warm, present, real. Nia, between them, was doing a thorough inventory of the middle distance. On the shelf across the room, a small frame, simple wood. Inside it, a photograph held together with a strip of clear tape down its center, the tear still visible, the image visible through the damage. It had been there since Imani moved in. One of the first things she unpacked, placed deliberately where it could be seen from anywhere in the room. Neither of them looked at it right now. They didn't need to. It was doing what it needed to do simply by being there, holding the record of what had broken and refusing to let anyone in this apartment forget that things had cost what they had cost. The morning continued. Nia decided that sitting up was now a reliable capability and moved on to her next investigation, which appeared to involve the texture of the blanket's edge. Imani did not pull her hand back. Tae-jun did not change his grip. They stayed where they were on the floor of a Capitol Hill apartment while their daughter worked methodically through the world's available information, and the light moved across the floor the way light does when it has nowhere else to be. And outside the city went about its business, ordinary and continuous, and entirely indifferent to the fact that two people on a blanket were quietly becoming something they had almost entirely destroyed before it had the chance to begin. Once, Seo Tae-jun had been a man who ruled through certainty, who treated fear as information to be suppressed rather than examined, who had torn a photograph in half and called it a decision and had been wrong in every direction that mattered. Now he sat on an apartment floor with his daughter between him and the woman he had failed so completely, and he held her hand without holding it too tightly, and he understood something that no amount of power or control or strategic competence had ever taught him. You could not build anything worth having out of the refusal to lose it. You had to be willing to hold things the way he was holding her hand right now, open, present, available, and accept that this was the only kind of holding that didn't eventually become something else. Nia looked up at both of them. Her face was very serious, very certain, very much her own. She had his chin and Imani's eyes, and the specific quality of attention that belonged to no one but herself. And she was 7 months old, and she was already more than either of them had known how to be at any age. She looked between them and then back at the blanket edge, apparently satisfied. And the morning held them all, imperfectly, stubbornly, without promise of anything except this specific moment, which was enough, which had always been enough, which was in fact the only thing that had ever been real.